Well, hello and welcome to tonight's In Conference With. Now, hopefully everything is working. Okay, let's just go. Yes, that's yes, we've got sound and everything there. So, In Conference With, this really, of course, is Wandering Bishop. This is me wandering aloud, talking, as it were, ad libitum on whatever kind of is on my mind. And there's usually quite a lot of things that are on my mind. And one of the things particularly was a question that was asked by one of our YouTube viewers. Indeed, he's the first, I believe, of our Patreon patrons. Which point I will remind you that you can support this apostolate and the various programs that we air and broadcast via Old Roman TV by becoming a Patreon supporter or patron. I will be sure to put the link in the show notes at the end of this broadcast, or if you click on today's broadcast of Mass, you'll find the links and everything there. Becoming a Patreon patron, of course, means also that you can have access to merch. I believe is the term, to merchandise. So you can have an Old Roman mug, T-shirt, hoodie, and there are various other incentives as well, depending on your level of subscription. So do look out for that. Or you can visit now www.patreon.com/Old Roman TV. But anyway, we'll see. Or I'm already digressing. So one of the questions that has come up recently is somebody wanted to was asking about the difference between the Old Roman position and that of Sedevacantism. And this is a question that often comes up. Where do we Old Romans fit in the kind of schema of traditional Catholicism, where, of course, you will find traditional Catholics in communion with Rome, or as part of the institutional conciliar church. Then you will have those who are traditional Catholics, not technically in the institutional church, like the Society of St. Pius X. Then you have Sedevacantists, who basically believe that the chair of St. Peter in Rome is vacant, that there currently is no valid pope, and there hasn't been since Pius XII, since 1958. And then you have Old Romans. So one of the things I'll do this evening is delve into the answer to that question and explain some of the slight differences between those groups. Now, I did want to share a quote. Ah, good, it's here. Because this is a good place to start. His Excellency Bishop Donald Sanborn, who is one of the leading Sedevacantists, gave a conference in 2013 and begins by asking and suggesting that this is a fundamental question that has to be answered. So, to quote, "The fundamental question concerning all of our reaction to Vatican II is this: is the religion of Vatican II Roman Catholicism or not? When I say religion, I mean the ensemble of doctrines, disciplines, and liturgical practices. Those are the three essential aspects of religion, any religion. Are those three things taken together the entire ensemble? Do they taken together represent and consist of Roman Catholicism? Is it Catholic or not? And there is a yes or no answer to that question. The answer to that question will determine everything else we think or do about the problem of Vatican II. He goes on, it's very important to situate yourself in that regard concerning that question. Usually the way that we go is by a reaction to the numinous. The traditional movement was born out of a reaction to the new Mass. But the Mass and liturgical practices of the Church are we might say, the face of the Church. They do not constitute the foundation of the Church. Doctrine does. And if we remain simply on the level of reacting to a Mass that we don't like, that we find something wrong with, but never getting down to the fundamentals, we are going to make errors. Because that is simply, essentially, a gut reaction. I don't like this. This doesn't speak to me as Catholicism or as a Catholic Mass. I don't like it. I want the traditional Latin Mass. That's usually the root of someone who is reacting to Vatican II. It's not wrong, but it is insufficient. Now, there are two particular points that I want to respond to in those words from Bishop Sanborn. The first thing is to note that he talks about a reaction to Vatican II. And particularly, of course, he is concerned with the new Mass, but he hangs the whole traditional movement off a reaction to Vatican II. Now, here straight away is a difference, an immediate difference between Old Romans and other traditionalists. Because for us, and the interesting thing is that now others are beginning to topple to it and to realize the issue for us as Old Romans is not Vatican II. I mean, Vatican II is an issue, don't get me wrong. But our issue, of course, as Old Romans goes back before Vatican II. In fact, it goes way back before even Vatican I. It goes right back to the 18th and early 19th century and to the Ultramontane party within Roman Catholicism. Ultramontane means to rule from over the mountains, meaning the centralization of power within Rome that began, and don't misunderstand me, of course, in the Western Church, Rome has always been the central source of authority, but there was greater, not necessarily autonomy, but there was greater freedom among the various national churches, among the various dioceses, etc., to run things themselves. But gradually and really at the beginning of the 19th century, end of the 18th century, as a reaction to the Enlightenment, there began this great push for centralizing power and authority in Rome, so that Rome basically wanted to be in control of everything. So an example would be, whereas before, for over 1,000 years, it was the norm for various dioceses, when there was a vacancy in see, in other words, when the bishop died and a new bishop needed to be appointed, invariably the diocese and the chapters of the cathedrals could nominate and elect the next bishop. Now, that in itself was a kind of formalization of the election process that had preceded it from the time almost of the apostles onwards. Remember that in Acts of the Apostles, one of the first things the apostles do is hold an election to replace Judas. Remember Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Jesus, then went off and hung himself. The apostles, seeking the guidance of the Holy Spirit, come together and elect from among the followers of Jesus somebody to replace Judas. So this notion of electing bishops goes all the way back to the New Testament. And basically throughout most of Christian history, until the end of the 18th century, 19th century, in the church, it was the usual common practice. On the whole, of course, there are innumerable exceptions, but the rule of thumb, the basic understanding, the basic principle was that the local diocese, meaning the local church, would elect from among themselves one to become the head of the church family in that place, to become the bishop, to become the successor of the apostles. Now, invariably, of course, Rome ratified that appointment. So, for an example, a cathedral chapter would, or a diocesan chapter would elect the next bishop. His name would be sent to Rome, and Rome would rubber stamp it and say, yes, that's okay. Or not sometimes. Of course, through the medieval period too, there were issues that eventually, of course, arrived at the Reformation, but where, for example, the appointment to sees, to dioceses, and various other preferments was usurped, and people were appointed by other people without necessarily going through due process, though sometimes there was a notion of an election and a notion of due process taking place, but not always. Anyway, the basic gist is that the local church would elect their father in God. That all began to change from really the Renaissance and the Enlightenment period onwards, where Rome, in a kind of reactionary way to the zeitgeist of the age, tried to take control and centralize control over everything. So that today, for example, in contemporary canon law, it's very clear that only the Pope can appoint bishops. And though there is a nominal process of election, and though there is a process where names can be suggested and put forward, at the end of the day, the Pope makes the decision and his decision goes. But that wasn't always the case. So then this was a particular beef, we might say, of the old Romans. They were reacting to this centralization of Roman power. And they were doing so by pointing out variously that, previous popes had granted rights in perpetuity to cathedral chapters to elect their bishops and to simply have Rome rubber stamp their appointments, etc. And this discussion actually was never properly concluded. Eventually it was when the 1917 Code of Canon Law came out, but by which time relationships between Old Romans and Rome itself had dissipated. So, going not to digress too much. So Bishop Sanborn's point about Vatican II and the beginning, as it were, of the traditional Catholic movement, for us as Old Romans, of course, no, we've been traditional Catholics for much longer than that. Vatican II is just, maybe the last straw on the camel's back, but there have been issues for almost 200 years prior to that. And I say it's interesting that others are toppling to this because some of you may be, of course, familiar with Dr. Taylor Marshall, and some of you may even have read his book, Infiltration, the plot to destroy the church from within. And he more or less goes back over 200 years of Roman history in the church to explain something of the problem, the crisis that many of us recognize exists in the church today. And he goes back to that time of the Enlightenment. But he doesn't quite hit the nail on the head. Frustrating thing reading this book is that several times, as Old Romans, it's like, oh, go on, take the next logical step, because the next logical step you'll have understood the whole situation correctly. But he's not far from it. He's not far from it. And indeed, even people like Bishop Athanasius Schneider, for example, have recognized that the issues that are affecting the church today go further back than Vatican II. The innovations in the liturgy, for example, go back before Vatican II. Indeed, one of the ironies of the Sedevacantist position in their holding that Pius XII was the last true pope is the fact that Pius XII was one who did the most damage to the traditional liturgy when in the late 1940s and early 50s, he tinkered with the Holy Week ceremonies. Ceremonies in Holy Week that had been consistent and developed over 1,500 years. He gave permission to a chap called Annibale Bonini and set up a commission, and they basically rewrote Holy Week. They rewrote practically the ceremonies of Holy Week. So Pius XII, although the Sedevacantists called him the last true pope, was actually a great wrecker of the liturgy, and in part because of what he did. What subsequently happened with Vatican II and the new Mass was likely to happen. He, as it were, had enabled that, had paved the way for that to happen. Likewise, too, Pius X. Now, he, of course, is the patron of the Society of St. Pius X, one of the largest and most well-known traditional Catholic groups, founded by Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, and has been going since the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s. Now, one of the ironies with them, because they again have been adherents to the traditional rite, but the interesting thing, the irony with them is, they deliberately chose St. Pius X as their patron because of his defense of the church against modernism right at the beginning of the 20th century, because of his encyclical Pascendi, for example, which condemned modernism. But of course, interestingly, one of the things about St. Pius X is that he too was a liturgical tinkerer. He couldn't keep his hands off the liturgy either. And indeed, in many ways, he paved the way for Pius XII to do the heinous thing he did later on to Holy Week. So few realize that St. Pius X, for example, reformed the Roman breviary, meaning the divine office, what the clergy are required to pray every day. He made quite significant reforms to that, to the calendar and the nature of the rubrics in the Mass, and various other things as well. So the irony, you see, from the Old Roman position that we see with these traditionalists is that even their icons, even their patrons, even the people they admire and look up to, thinking that they were paragons of tradition, in fact weren't. Pius XII wrecked Holy Week and various other things, and Pius X even mucked about with the liturgy. And that and the problem that of course comes from is the fact that their predecessor, Pius IX, again, somebody whom traditional Catholics rate as the great epitome of traditional Catholicism, He, of course, who promulgated Pastor Eternus of Vatican I, that declared the Pope infallible. Pius IX himself was a reactionary rather than a traditionalist. In fact, when it came to Vatican I, for example, and to this notion of papal infallibility, the famous anecdote is a cardinal said to him, "But Holy Father, what about tradition?" To which Pius IX said, "Tradition? I am tradition." Now, there, of course, he was rather using a bit of hubris and a bit of hyperbole to suggest that the Petrine office, as he saw it, embodied tradition, and that he, being thus Peter, was the embodiment of tradition. And the problem is with that, after that, of course, subsequent popes who shared the same name, Pius X and Pius XII, obviously, they thought that they were the embodiment of tradition, that they were tradition, that they could establish and set tradition. But as even Benedict XVI correctly pointed out about the Petrine ministry, is that the job of the Pope is not to create and not to innovate, but to guard and defend tradition. He is not the arbiter of tradition, he is the guardian of tradition. So it's not for the Pope to introduce new things and novel things, nor is it really for him to necessarily dictate what is and what is not tradition. Tradition is what it is. Otherwise, it wouldn't be traditional. Tradition is something that we can see grow and develop in the church. Everyone can, we all have the sensus fidelium of what tradition is. We can see it and follow it for ourselves. And this is what Taylor Marshall, you see, going back again, this is what Taylor Marshall in his book, going back to the 1800s, is he's getting close, as it were, to understanding the issue. But of course, he's fallen into that trap of thinking that Pius IX was the best thing since sliced bread. But the problem with Pius IX is essentially that he was a reactionary. Things were getting to such a state that in Italy, for example, the papal states were under attack. See, people forget the Italian Civil War in the mid-19th century, where the Pope was the temporal ruler of great swathes of land in Italy. He was essentially the monarch, the king of those states. And with the Italian Civil War, of course, there was revolution, and those temporal states were lost. Those temporal states were lost. And that is essentially, when Pius IX became Pope, he was regarded as something of a liberal. And that was fine until the Civil War, and until actually one of his officials was murdered. He himself had to flee for safety, and that's when he became a reactionary. You see, I won't say conservative. He became a reactionary, and indeed, because everything that follows after that period, from about 1850 onwards, if you know history, you can see that Pius IX was reacting to events, reacting to things that were going on. He was reactionary. He wasn't conserving and he wasn't preserving tradition for tradition's sake. He was reacting and often using tradition as a reactionary tool to try and justify his responses to things. So you see the problem, I hope, and you see that what the difference is then between Old Romans and traditional Catholics, because we've seen And we recognized a long time before the others that there was a problem, that there were serious issues within the church. And unfortunately, our forebears, the Ultrajektine fathers in Holland, at the beginning of the 19th century, weren't able, they weren't powerful, they weren't a force enough themselves. Though they gave warnings to Rome, they explained their arguments, but Pius IX, again, being reactionary, he just wouldn't hear reason. And so eventually, of course, 1870, papal infallibility comes in. And again, the interesting thing about that is at the beginning of the 19th century, the notion of papal infallibility was considered a slur on the Catholic religion. In Catholic catechisms, if papal infallibility was mentioned at all, it was mentioned as a slur, as an insult on the Catholic faith by Protestants. And again, if you look at history, and if you read the history in the coming up to the Catholic Emancipation Act in Great Britain in 1830, remember that after the Reformation in England, or basically after the Act of Settlement of Elizabeth I, until the Catholic Emancipation Act, Catholics were thought to be traitors. Catholics were not allowed to hold public office. They couldn't be elected members of Parliament, so on and so forth. And part of the accusation, of course, was that Catholics were believed to hold allegiance to the Pope above their own monarchs, above their own kings and queens. That in itself, of course, was a reactionary notion after Paul the Fourth or Paul the Fifth, I think, issued a bull of excommunication against Elizabeth I, where he absolved all Catholics in England from owing or paying allegiance to her as monarch. That didn't help things. Didn't help matters. That's why there's this notion of Catholics as traitors. And again, things like Guy Fawkes, all the rest of it, that hasn't helped. That didn't help either. But interesting to note that at the beginning of the 19th century, Irish and English Catholic bishops were writing letters to Parliament, assuring members of Parliament that they did not hold, as Catholics, obedience to the Pope in all things with regard to what otherwise they would owe allegiance to as citizens of the land. So you have catechisms at the beginning of the 19th century saying that papal infallibility is a slur on the Catholic religion. The very notion and idea of it is a Protestant slur. And you have Catholic bishops writing to Parliament saying, no, we are as loyal citizens as anybody else, and the Holy Father in Rome, of course, we owe him obedience spiritually, and we owe allegiance to him spiritually. But in terms of temporal affairs, in terms of matters of state and so on and so forth, we are, like everybody else, a citizen of the United Kingdom. So you see how different things were at the beginning of the 19th century to the way they were by the end of the 19th century, and by 1870, when you have Pius IX declaring himself, or the papal office, infallible. So in those, we might say, 70 years, papal infallibility, which had been a Protestant slur on the Catholic religion, as stated in catechisms, official catechisms, was by the end, almost before the, just 70 years later, suddenly was dogma, suddenly was Catholic dogma. And you see the problem, that anecdote about the cardinal saying, but Holy Father, what about tradition? Tradition, I am tradition. You see, the mess, that the crisis that the church is in now goes way back. And so that's essentially the difference between Old Romans and other traditional Catholics. And of course, the other thing to note then, regarding, for example, the liturgy. The liturgy is a touchstone, one might say, of traditional Catholicism. I would say it's probably more like a touch paper in the sense of it sparks embers. But even then, you see, the Society of St. Pius X, for example, are only use the traditional liturgy in as much as they use the 1962 edition of the Roman Missal. Now that contains all the tinkering by Pius X and Pius XII, and indeed John the 23rd. The Sedevacantists tend to use the 1954, or properly speaking, use editions prior to 1955 of the Roman Missal, but still observing all the tinkering that Pius X did, and of course most of what Pius XII did, except for Holy Week. Whereas Old Romans, our cut-off point, as it were, is 1909, and that's because Archbishop Matthew published an English vernacular translation of the Roman rites as they were at the beginning of the 20th century. But prior to that, they were basically of the last typical edition, which was 1886 of the Roman Missal. And that typical edition of 1886, all that happened in that edition was various propers of new saints subsequent to the previous edition were inserted into the Missal. Now that was the edition prior to 1886, way back to the 1600s. There were only, I think, three editions post the first edition of the Tridentine Rite, and there were a good 100 of years between the third and fourth. And it's that Old Romans, for example, it's that which we use essentially, and even then, arguably, we use an older version even than that, because of course the 1886, for example, would include the new propers for the new feast and dogma of the Immaculate Conception, but that only came in 1854. And as Old Romans, of course, we use the Mass and observe the feast of the Conception, as it was prior to 1854 and had been for hundreds of years before that. So in one sense, again, going back to the beginning, but Bishop Sanborn is right to say that the liturgy is important, is relevant, but fundamentally the question is about dogma, is about doctrine. And I hope you can see there that is a key, is a problem, because actually even doctrinally there are issues going way back to the 19th century. So this notion of traditional Catholicism as conceived by the Society of St. Pius X and by the Sedevacantists is not traditional at all, in the sense that it's 20th century, whereas Old Romans hold to traditions that go way back prior to the 20th century and were extant for centuries before that. And this is why we, of course, often say to them, lex orandi, lex credendi. The reason why we hold to the old forms of the Roman Mass and Rituale, the Pontificale, etc., is because enshrined there is what the Church can easily be argued. Enshrined there is what the Church has always believed. When the Piuses 9, 10, and 12 start mucking about with things, they reverse the maxim. Now it's interesting because Pius XII did in fact deliberately reverse the maxim to say lex credendi, lex orandi. His argument being that the liturgy exposes. Sorry, let's just be clear. Okay, the original maxim is lex orandi, lex credendi. The law of prayer is the law of belief. In other words, what we pray is what we believe. Pius XII, and really by if not by deliberate intent, by action, the other Piuses 9 and 10 did the same thing. They swapped it round to say lex credendi, lex orandi. So they were saying that what we believe determines how we worship. Now, actually, in both senses, and of course, the problem with Latin is that whichever way round you say it, technically in Latin doesn't alter the meaning, but it's the emphasis, of course, notionally in the concept of things. Now, the old idea of lex orandi first, lex orandi, lex credendi, was making the point that in the Church's prayer, that you can, as it were, by virtue of the Church's prayer, understand and see what the Church believes. And it's interesting that it's only those who have sought to essentially introduce new dogmas who have changed things around to say lex credendi, lex orandi. Because, for example, if we let's take Pius IX and Pius XII, and let's take the two so-called ex cathedra statements, dogmatic pronouncements of the Immaculate Conception and the Assumption. Now, first thing first, the Church has basically always held essentially the two doctrines of the sinlessness and the purity of the Blessed Virgin Mary and of her Assumption into heaven. The Church has always held those beliefs. And so in the Missal, the Church had propers for the feasts, for the masses on those 2 days, which have been the same for centuries. So the Missal hadn't been changed for centuries. So the same mass that the medieval monks were singing for the Assumption, Gaudeamus Omnes, had been the same for centuries, hundreds of years. Now, what both popes did was when they promulgated the dogmas, they changed the propers of the masses for the feasts. Now, the question, of course, that we would pose as Old Romans is, well, hold on a minute. If you're only defining, if you're only promulgating what has always been believed, why do you need to alter the liturgy to reflect your new dogma, which you say isn't new, but it is, because you're only now declaring it a dogma? But why are you altering the liturgy as well, if the liturgy has always told us what we believe? Lex orandi, lex credendi. And this is where, of course, you see that they turn that maxim around. Lex credendi, lex orandi. Because the matter that was important for them was about the dogmatization of these doctrines. They wanted to make a point of dogmatizing these doctrines. Now, the irony is, of course, is that, as I say, they didn't need dogmatization in the sense that they had been believed previously. And the liturgy reflected the church's belief in those doctrines previously. So even if they were only defining what already was, why did they need to change the Mass? Answer is, they didn't, but they had to make a point of it. But also because, in fact, by dogmatizing these doctrines, they were, in fact, doing something new. Now, remember that the difference between dogma and doctrine, dogma is something that you have to believe in. That is, you are required to believe it for salvation. That is what a dogma is. A doctrine is a teaching. And within the Catholic faith, of course, there are doctrines and there are dogmas. Now, essential dogmas, of course, fundamental dogmas have always been things like the virgin birth, have been the perpetual virginity of Mary, have been the divinity of Christ, the Holy Trinity, etc., etc. And all these things were known and basically defined way back early. We might even say in the first 500 years of the first millennium of the church's existence, what were called the Great Ecumenical Councils: Constantinople, Nicaea, Ephesus, etc. These things, and the important thing there is, read the councils. What the councils were doing were defining that which already was believed. They weren't defining new doctrines or new dogmas. They were simply clarifying what had always been believed. And they were doing so in opposition to heresies. So the reason why the councils took place invariably was because it was to address a heresy. It wasn't to say, from now on, this is what we believe. It rather, the councils were saying, in response to a heresy, this is what the church has always believed. So this is very important, you see, because when you start adding, when you make something a dogma and you require its belief for salvation, then you are essentially creating something new. You see, when 1800 years have more or less elapsed, or for argument's sake, let's say at least 1,000 years, if not 1,500 years, between the early church and the patristic fathers and the ecumenical councils gradually having defined and dogmatized what the church had always believed. If you add something 1,500 years later, see, the logical question then would be, well, what about all those Catholic Christians in those preceding 1,500 years? Are they saved or not? Now, of course, of course they were. But you see the problem with this notion of development. Now, it's an interesting thing. John Cardinal Newman, he, of course, developed a theory of the development of doctrine. But notice development of doctrine, not development of dogma, development of doctrine, in which the Cardinal says that, obviously, over time, the Church's understanding of essential truth becomes clearer, becomes more clarified. And this resonates, of course, with our Lord's own words about the Holy Spirit to the Church, and he will guide you into all truth. But the point is that it's not new truth. Truth itself can't develop into something new. Truth is something that has always been. And this is part of the problem, and part of the crisis has been in the Church for these past 200 years. You see, the very notion, the very idea that all of a sudden you can declare new requirements for salvation, because that's essentially what the two new dogmas did. That's what they do. I mean, that's what a dogma does. So, very idea, you see, that is really the antithesis of tradition. And understand, yes, tradition is living. Yes, our understanding of the teachings of the Church can grow and develop, become clearer, more defined over time. Absolutely. But you can't suddenly declare new things. You can't suddenly make some things more than they were before. Because, as a phrase of mine that some of you will be familiar with, God does not move the goalposts of salvation. The requirements for salvation must be the same today as they were for the guy on the cross next to Jesus. You can't start mucking about with these things. And this, of course, then is the problem today. This has been the problem of the last 200 years in Catholicism. Is suddenly this notion that tradition is something that can be altered, that tradition is something that can be tinkered with. It's a false understanding of tradition. Tradition must be constant, must be consistent. Yes, our understanding can become clearer, but the truth is always the same, has to be. And the trouble is with Vatican I, and later, of course, with Vatican II, the issues with Vatican II are there at Vatican I, where already the notion of tradition is warped, is askewed. Now, at Vatican I, it's done so in a reactionary way to the events of that time. At Vatican II, of course, almost 100 years later, 2 world wars have gone on, but also, too, the liturgy itself has been tinkered with and has therefore altered, as it were. the perception and the reception in understanding of what tradition is. Now, this really, of course, comes to the fore with Vatican II and post-Vatican II, the new Mass, where, yeah, everybody admits it's all change, and where arguments for the various changes themselves betray this misunderstanding of what tradition is, and particularly of what living tradition is. But I also appreciate why this is confusing, can be confusing for traditional-minded Catholics, because clearly even the popes themselves were confused. Because they had developed this false understanding, this false knowledge of what tradition is, such that they thought that they could alter tradition, that they had power over tradition. But this is why the confusion, for example, you get this topsy-turvydom in, for example, the attitude of Pius XII, who on the one hand condemns what he calls false liturgical archaeologicism, where people in the new liturgical movement were looking to the past and saying, oh, well, in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, they used to do things this way, we ought to return to that. And Pius XII was right. On this, he was right. He was right to say, no, that's false liturgical archaeologicism. Don't go down that route. We have received the tradition of the liturgy as it is now. It is, as Benedict XVI would say, it has organically developed over the past 1800 years to what it is now, or what it was then. So on the one hand, he seems to get it. On the one hand, he seems to have the right appreciation of tradition. But then he goes and alters drastically the Holy Week rites and liturgies. He goes and dogmatizes something that was never dogmatized before, but was always held as a doctrine, sincerely held doctrine of the Church, universal by East and West, for no reason, because it doesn't actually define anything either. See, there's always been this question as to whether or not Our Lady died and then was assumed, or whether she avoided death and went straight into heaven. Now, there have been doctrinal discussions about that from the earliest days. And if you were going to define something, you might want to define that. But again, he doesn't do that. All he says is, in his encyclical, Mediator Dei, he makes the point. He references the fact that there has been this difference in tradition as to whether Our Lady died and then was assumed, or whether she went straight in to heaven. But he doesn't settle that argument. So you're kind of left thinking, well, what was the point of the dogmatization at all? Nothing was clarified. Now, the whole point, supposedly, of papal infallibility is for the Pope to supposedly define and clear up some question of the faith and define and standardize it. Well, what definition, what clarity was brought by Pius XII's Mediator Dei? The dogmatization of the Assumption? Nothing. Nothing was changed. Nothing was altered. We're still left with the same questions, which are not important. Ultimately, doesn't matter. Both traditions agree that Our Lady was assumed into heaven. There's no doubt about that. And then, of course, we have to ask, well, then why did he alter the Mass? Why did he alter the Mass for the Assumption? The same Mass for the Assumption had been said for centuries. It's a beautiful setting. The Gregorian chant for Gaudeamus Omnes, the introit for the Feast of the Assumption, is beautiful. Why? Why would you alter it? If the meaning and the teaching hasn't changed, why would you alter it? And so there you see this confusion. This confusion in the church is already is manifest there. So that what happens at Vatican II and what happens afterwards, in many ways, is inevitable. Because, and this is the insidious nature, one might say, of modernism and reactionism. Dangerous mix, a heady mix that does make people do foolish things. Pius IX reigning against modernism, reactionism. Ironically, then, does modernist things by changing things. Pius X rails against modernism, draws up the oath against modernism. So you have the syllabus of errors from Pius IX, then you have the oath against modernism and the great encyclical Pascendi. And in many ways, absolutely, Pius X nails it on the head in terms of what modernism is, but he responds with reactionism, like Pius IX did. Not with, I would say, and who am I to say, but not with tradition, not with the calmness, the centeredness of tradition. Then, of course, Pius XII, likewise, now is the summation of all this confusion. And largely, again, these three Piuses, they bring about, they pave the way for what is going to happen at Vatican II. So, as you can see, after an hour there, I've not really even touched on Vatican II yet, or the new Mass. And that, then, is the essential difference between Old Romans and traditional Catholics like the Sedevacantists and the SSPX, etc. For us, we recognize, we diagnosed the crisis in the church a long time ago. We are not reacting to Vatican II. We you know, if we were reacting to anything, we were reacting prior to 1817 Vatican I. If anything, we were reacting against the reactionism of Pius IX. And it's for that reason that we're called Old Romans. Essentially because all we have sought to do, and all our forebears, our ultra-Dictine forebears sought to do, was to hold to that which had always been. And that is essentially the rule of thumb for us as Old Romans in our approach to the liturgy, in our approach to doctrine, in our approach to the practice of the faith. We're just preserving what always was. And we do so for the sake of the church today. We do so for the sake of the church today. We do so in the hope that in continuing and preserving what always was, Catholics who truly want to be faithful and truly want to know the tradition will be able to find it and thus be able themselves to live it and practice it and realize it. And we do this because this is the tradition that saints were raised in. This is the tradition that grew from the blood of the martyrs. Now, it does seem, I know, preposterous to some people to think that the church today has suffered a malaise for 200 years. But the truth of the matter is, it has. And largely because it did not respond appropriately nor well to the Enlightenment. Again, one of the great pities about the Counter-Reformation was that it didn't happen sooner. The problem now, though, however, is that the church has not responded well to the notion of enlightenment, nor to everything that's followed since. And even we might say that Vatican II itself was reactionary. It was reactionary. It wasn't calm. It wasn't considered. Well, certainly the implementation of it. But already the confusion was there, which is why the documents, I mean, we've had various authors say of those documents, say that they were deliberately ambiguous, etc. But it's obvious that is so because confusion already existed, already abounded about what is and what isn't tradition, what is and what isn't anything. And again, John the 23rd himself said, talking about the convening of the council, that it was to address, for the church to address the modern world, how to address the modern world. Straight away there is a problem. Now, of course, that's the point, though. True tradition is living tradition. And of course, the church does evolve over time. She does evolve. There are things, that we do now that weren't done before. That's the organic nature of tradition, is that it develops and it evolves, but it doesn't do so in a reactionary way. It's a gradual unfolding, a gradual process. And this, of course, is the point that Benedict the 16th himself makes when he talks about this hermeneutic, this desire for a hermeneutic of continuity as opposed to rupture that Vatican II was. And if we think about this in a kind of liturgical way, if you look at the development of the Roman Missal, now there are some who argue, there were some who say that the Tridentine Rite itself was reactionary, that it was somehow kind of brushly imposed upon the whole. That's not true. That's not true. When Pius V promulgated the Missal after the Council of Trent, he codified and made available universally what was the custom, tradition, and practice at Rome, and invited others to adopt it. But he also said any extant use of the Latin rite, extant for 200 years prior, is allowed and can continue. Now, some of you will know, have studied literature, that you had the Sarum use, the Ambrosian rite, the Braga rite. There are various different local, as it were, uses, slight variations of the rubrics and the way things were done liturgically in different places around. Pius XII said, Pius V said, that's fine. They can continue. The religious orders often had their own versions or uses, so that the Dominicans, of course, had their own use. The Benedictines even had their own use. The Franciscans technically didn't have their own use because their use was to use the Roman use. But anyway, all the different religious orders had, as it were, slight variations in the way that they would celebrate Mass or celebrate the divine office or whatever. And all this was permitted. All this was perfectly permissible. When the Tridentine Rite was promulgated, it wasn't done so deliberately to impose a kind of false universalism. It wasn't. All these local usages, all these variants in rite could all continue. What happened was that the vast majority at the time said, oh, no, we'd like to do what you do, Holy Father. And so they themselves gave up, forsook their particular usages and rites, and adopted that which had been codified as the Roman rite in the Tridentine Missal. But the point is, the Tridentine Missal codification itself was not, there was nothing drastic in what the Missal promulgated did, in the sense that it didn't suddenly introduce new things, it didn't suddenly discard old things. All it did was to say, this is the practice in Rome. You're more than happy, you're most welcome to adopt it. Now, with the Novus Ordo, the Mass of Paul VI, that was an utter break with all that had gone before. So that you can arguably see in the form of the Ordo of Mass, you can see, as it were, the skeleton, the bare bones that you can compare with the old Missal. But that's about it. That's about it. Otherwise, everything else, the rubrics and everything, have been, as it were, deconstructed, reconstructed, and turned the thing into something in stark contrast to what went before. And this exists particularly, for example, in this. Whereas the old Mass was about sacrifice, and the new Mass is about a meal. And of course, he's not helped by the fact that people like Bugnini and others, his collaborators who were involved in the creation of the new Missal, have admitted that they did what they did deliberately to make it palatable and acceptable to Protestants. And arguably, even then, I get that they were probably doing it from, well, not from bad motives, not from necessarily sinful motives. I don't go in for all that Freemasonry, conspiracy theories and all the rest of it that many of the Sedevacantists and traditional Catholics do. It really is by the by. The point is that things had gotten to such a state that people couldn't tell. They didn't know what they were doing anymore. And again, because it was all reactionism. It was all reactionism. So I will certainly talk about Vatican II and the problems with the liturgy. I mean, in many ways, I generally don't, because I don't need to. That's what everybody else does. that's out there. God rest his soul, but Father Anthony Chidaka, who just reposed recently, his work, which I suppose will now define his ministry and faithful apostolate and witness, work of human hands. If you want to know what this rupture with tradition expressed liturgically was in the New Rite, then read his book, Father Anthony Chidaka, Work of Human Hands. That will explain it beautifully. But my point, my beef, and the old Roman beef, as it were, position or problem, is that all these things that happened at Vatican II and afterwards, these are just the logical fruit and results of what would happen because of what because of this reactionism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, this reactionism that skewed true appreciation of what tradition is. So there we are. Now, I'm not going to take questions now, but you're more than welcome in the comments to leave questions if you have any. Please do, and I may pick them up and try to address them in another conference. But I hope that explains the difference, the essential difference, the fundamental difference between Old Roman and traditional Catholic in the sense of SSPX, Sedevacantism, etc. That is the essential difference between us, is that we maintain and preserve and talk about a much older and authentic tradition, and they really are only talking about the 20th century, and they are talking about reactionism. Okay, well, bless you. Thank you for watching. I hope that was interesting. And hopefully we'll see you online again very soon. Mass, of course, tomorrow at 8:30. Mass is broadcast every day at 8:30 in the true traditional Latin liturgy. The Angelus, of course, is broadcast at midday and at 6 p.m. together with the daily rosary. So I hope you'll join us then. And as I say, I will put in the notes for this program copy from the Mass broadcasts, etc., so that you can have the details, website details for becoming a Patreon patron of this apostolate, and seek to help defray the costs, and in return gain some merch for yourselves of mugs and t-shirts and whatnot. Okay, bless you all, thank you, and we'll see you soon.